Hello, welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Barbara Rutstein, the moderator of today's program. We will discuss this state Proposition 103, called Bright Colorado. If passed, it will increase the state sales tax and income tax to 1999 levels. The sales tax will increase from 2.9% to 3%, and the income tax will increase from 4.63% to 5%. The increased funding will be in place for 5 years, beginning in 2012. The estimated $3 billion raised over the 5 years will be used to fund education, preschool through 12th grade, and for higher education. To discuss the arguments for and against Proposition 103, we have on my right Penn Pfiffner. He is chairman of 2 Taxing for Colorado. And on his right is Carol Hedges, director of the Colorado Fiscal Policy Institute. Welcome to both of you and to our studio and viewing audiences. Carol, please tell us how and why you got involved in Bright Colorado.
Oh, thanks so much. I work for the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, and the project specifically I work for is the Colorado Fiscal Policy Institute. And over the last 10 years or so, the Institute has been working on issues of working for justice and economic security for all Coloradans. And in the last decade, we've really been struggling, economically in the state as we've dealt with sort of back-to-back recessions. And particularly in the recession that began in 2008, as the legislature was dealing with the consequences, the economic consequences of that recession, we've really been looking for a balanced approach that balances reductions in services, tightening of the belt of our public investments, with the ability to provide the services that communities need in order to have a foundation for the economy to grow. And quite frankly, the only thing that's available on the ballot to move toward this balanced approach is Proposition 103.
Okay, and Penn, what's your opinion?
Well, you may be searching for balance, but this doesn't give it to you. The problem is that you've got a tax increase proposal that's just massive. It's really an extreme proposal to raise government's general fund by about 7%. And this is happening in an economy that's growing less than 1%. So families are struggling to pay things like energy costs and gasoline and food prices in a time when unemployment is high. And we know that the last thing you should do is raise taxes at this point, and this is a very large tax increase. It's not fair, it's not reasonable, and it's not right. Furthermore, from the introduction and from what Ms. Hedges has said, the hope is that it'll go for education. And yet when you look at the language itself, there's no reporting, there's no accountability, and so it's just this new money would be dumped into the general fund where your taxes go now, with the hope, the hope that the legislature would give it all to education, but with no strong instructions, nor any way of accounting for it all the way through.
Okay, do you agree with that? Is there something that would prevent it from going
The language in Proposition 103 clearly spells out that all of the revenue raised from returning our tax rates back to what they were in 1999 will be used for early childhood, preschool through higher education. It is not a constitutional amendment. If it had been a constitutional amendment and we were having this discussion, I would suggest that Mr. Pfiffner would be arguing it was a terrible idea because we were putting it in the Constitution and made it impossible to change. We've done everything we can working with good lawyers to figure out a way that we can instruct through a vote of the people what this money's to be used for. Now, can the legislature, and through passing a bill to completely reject whatever the people want, requiring the signature of the governor? Yeah, I mean, that's the system That's the system. The other, but that's not what's going to happen. That's not what's intended to happen. That's not what voters are going to hold their elected officials accountable for. And I think that's, we're doing the very best we can. There are no guarantees in this world, but it's clear that that's where the language says. And at some point, and I know it's not popular to have faith in elected officials these days, but at some point we've got to have a little faith in one another. I want to add one other thing before we get on to another question. This massive tax increase that Mr. Pfiffner referred to was the same massive tax cut that we all got back in 1999. And it is really important to remember. Do you remember how massive that was? I'm not sure that we can talk about that kind of reduction as massive. Certainly the Denver Post doesn't call it that. They call it reasonable and responsible. But it is an increase. It is an increase of an investment of all of our dollars in our community, and particularly our schools, because that really is the foundation for jobs in our economy. And that's absolutely the balance we think that Coloradans are looking for.
Okay.
Let's go back to the language and do a thought experiment about this. The language says we'd like it to go to education. We know that the nonpartisan, non-political research group at the Capitol, the Legislative Council staff, has said that this is going to raise $514 million in the first year. When you then say, what could change that increase besides just a rate increase? Maybe the economy is going to be better. If it is, does that extra money, will we know how much should be associated with just the economy and how much with these rates? What if the economy goes down and you don't see even an increase of 514? How are you going to parse that out and say, well, we know how to give this much to education and the rest for all those other things that government's supposed to do? It's clearly not possible because you haven't segregated the funds, Ms. Hedges, the way, say, that Amendment 23 did, where clearly money is diverted and put into a separate pot. This all gets dumped into the general fund. Would you think differently about such a tax increase if you didn't think it would help your community, your family? And that's what you've got to recognize, is that this all goes to the General Assembly, and they decide how to send it out. So you may not see much money in your local school district or any at your school. If you have kids in college, you don't know how much of this is supposed to go there, or whether the legislature will do what it's had to do in the last several years, which is pretty much ignore additional funding for higher education. So it's not only a statutory problem, which quite frankly, I think Ms. Hedges and I would agree is the appropriate way to go here, but it is also a very poorly worded, very incomplete measure that really does nothing to assure that education is helped, and therefore you have to see it for what it truly is, which is a very large 7% increase the first year in taxes.
Okay, go ahead.
If I may, the staff at the legislature is pretty well educated, and figuring out what percentage of the increase of the money came from the increase is really just an arithmetic problem. Don't let this conversation confuse you. It's pretty easy to figure out. If you generate this much money, you can figure out how much of it came from the increase between 4.63 and 3.7. This is the scare tactic, that somehow this money is we're not going to be able to figure it out, and it's going to get dumped into a pot of money that's not going to be used in a way it's supposed to. Well, the legislature, and I may be in the minority, I don't think I am, but I actually think the legislature's pretty responsible about trying to do the right thing. I know that last year when they were faced with significant budget cuts, and one of the only options was to cut K-12 education. And when they got additional resources, they put that money into the schools because they understand, like we all understand, that the number one priority, not for the future, but not just for the future, but for our economy, is educating our kids well. Now, the point of, do we know exactly how much you individually are going to get, or exactly what the effect on the tuition rate at CSU is going to be, or exactly what your school district is going to use that money for? he's right. We can't possibly predict exactly what's going to happen with that money. What we can do is be sure that schools are going to get what they got in 2012, and that any money generated on top of that is going to go to preschool through higher education, and we can guarantee that that money is going to come to your school district for your school board to decide how to use it in the best interest of your community. Those are the things that we do know are going to happen. Exactly what that dollar amount for your pocket, he's right. We're not exactly going to know.
So, Bev, I think you're going to see here a point of disagreement. We're never going to close that.
Okay.
I think Ms. Hedges is looking at things through rose-colored glasses and saying, you know, it'll be just fine. But having been down there and seen, if you will, the chaos that happens in 120 days when you try to resolve things, when months after the vote is occurring, you're trying to figure out what has changed, how do we react to new needs, perhaps in healthcare or in human services. It won't be that clear-cut, especially without a segregated fund.
Let me just make a commitment. We'll both be there holding them accountable if they don't do what they said they were going to do.
The other point that needs to be made is it does have an intent in this language. The Proposition 103 says this is what we want you to do with the money. When it comes to what the staff will do, they'll probably set up a formula. And part of that formula will say you can't go lower than what you did last year. But supposedly, Amendment 23 already does that. You already have a constitutional provision that's supposed to provide that protection.
You know, that's actually, according to a legal opinion, that's unfortunately not exactly what 23 said. It's what we want, what a lot of us wanted it to say.
And expected.
But because of an opinion about this, a very complicated formula, that's the reason we didn't do it the way we did in 23. We didn't go and say it has to be based on some complicated formula. It's not a complicated formula. It's the number of dollars that were appropriated in 2012. Now, I know that Penn doesn't always believe in the quality of the folks who work for the public sector, but you know what? We're pretty good. They're pretty good. I don't work for the public sector. They're pretty good at reading that. I think they're going to be able to figure out what the bottom is. How much we spent in 2012. And you know what? I want to be really clear about this, folks. There is no guarantee that something horrible might happen and that they might not do this. But you know what? I still have faith, and I may have on rose-colored glasses. But I actually believe that our Constitution says there's a value of what people say. And when people say we want you to spend what you did in 2012 and give all the money that comes from the increased increment to schools, I think our legislators are going to do that. And as I interrupted rudely to say, I'll be right there with you, Penn, when you're down there complaining if they do something different. I promise you that.
Bev, we need to talk about the effect of this.
Sure, go ahead.
Because it certainly does a lot to families and businesses that we haven't even covered. When you talk about the difficulty we have faced through a very deep recession and a struggling recovery, you've got to recognize what it does for the families. And I think families are saying to government, you haven't cut back the way we have had to cut back. Whether you look at the employment changes in the private sector versus the government sector, whether you look at the changes in the budget, private sector versus government sector. They're saying we expect you, government, to make sense of things, to spend the money we give you, not just to say, well, there's a problem here, so we want more money. We haven't talked, and I suspect we won't have time, and I don't think it's anything more than a tangential issue anyway, to say we have given, over the course of the last several decades, 50% more since about 1980 in real dollars after inflation into the school system and have seen almost no change in outcomes. So you have to change the way you do schooling, and you have to change the way you do budgeting. I also work with the Independence Institute. Last year we put out a roadmap for sustainable government, gave about $1 billion of different ways to organize and work government, and yet your group and Senator Heath never put forth one of these proposals as a way to try to control costs. So your only reaction, unfortunately, on this ballot is what do we take out of our family budgets? How do we hurt entrepreneurs and business owners who we want to have grow with a greater burden without ever asking how do we do it better with the money we have?
And you know, this is another place that, Penn, you and I agree. It is about those families. You are exactly right. It is about those families. And what we've found in the last 2 or 3 years as a result of the recession and the contraction in our ability to support community services, the fees that parents are paying to get their kids and keep their kids in schools are going way, way up. We're paying, those families are paying for it now. And bottom line, based upon the estimate that we just got yesterday from the Legislative Council, there's going to be another somewhere between $200 and $300 million coming out of K-12 if we don't pass 103, which means those fees are going to go up again and again and again. If a family is struggling and doesn't have a job, their income tax responsibility is going to be very, very low. That's sort of the point of the income tax. I couldn't agree more this is about families, because we are pushing more and more of the responsibility of schooling children, public schools, a commitment that we've had in this country from its very beginning, that we do that as a community. We're pushing that onto the responsibilities of the individuals. This is an attempt to take, for the people, yes, absolutely, tax people who are doing okay. If your income is solid and stable through this recession, and quite frankly, personal income is growing in the state of Colorado about 4%, there are some people that are doing okay. Let's ask them, as Tabor says, ask them, ask us, are we willing to put a little bit more in to help those families who are struggling? And I also want to say, let's talk about what the actual effect on those families is. The Census Bureau just came out with the most recent median income family median family income in Colorado. It's about $54,000 a year. That family will, a family earning $54,000 a year will pay $126 more in taxes. That's a combination of both their income tax and their sales tax obligation. We know that school districts across the state are going to 4-day, many of them are going to 4-day school weeks. Now, those of you who know somebody who's got their children in childcare, that amount pays for about just a couple of days of childcare. And if you only got your kid, if you only have your child, you know, if you have to provide childcare for them 4 days a week, it's a huge, huge expense. The only thing else I want to do is I also want to agree with Penn. I would love you to read the report that he held up. And I would love you to read that report and ask yourself, is that the kind of community that you want to live in? A community that doesn't fund public health, that privatizes schools and higher education. I'm not going to try to even influence your opinion about that. I do urge you to see if that's the Colorado you want, or if you're more interested in a Colorado where we adequately, or that we stop cutting. It's not even that we're going to be adequately funding schools. It's a question of not taking additional cuts out of K-12 education and higher education.
Well, Ms. Hedges, as you throw it back,
Yes.
I would ask you, if you really believe it's about the families, to stop hurting them. You can't help children by bankrupting them, and I'm quoting Senator Bill Cadman here. And I also know that as people have been thinking about how to improve our Colorado situation, quoting Governor Hickenlooper, after his tour through the state, he said for a couple of neighborhoods in Boulder, there's no appetite for taxes anywhere all over the state. So let's talk about that amount and the families, because we've been talking millions, $514 million, but I'm not a millionaire. I wouldn't know $1 million if I fell into it. But what does this mean for our families? With 5 million of us here, that's about $100 per capita, but you have only about 54% of the workforce, the population in the workforce. And so you have about 2.3 million households, somewhere in there. So you're talking about $250 a family. How many times can you fill up a gas tank on that? What proportion of a family's food budget is that? This is a big increase. It'll make a big difference. And I would ask you to consider that Ms. Hedges asks you to start funding education, as if we haven't put the first dollar toward it yet. Yet Amendment 23 this year, that was the measure that was supposed to solve our problem back in 2001, it has added this coming year $384 million. Referendum C came 5 years later, roughly, and it was also supposed to go to education and solve our problems. Again, going back to that nonpartisan staff, they're finding $927 million, almost twice what we're being asked for here, from Referendum C money. Some of that was to go for other places than education, but a lot of it was to go through either K through 12 or higher education. In the recovery this year, the legislature put almost $300 million more toward education. That was in the budget just finished. Now we're seeing $364 million projected for next year. So you've got a nascent recovery, and in spite of the assurance that Ms. Hedges gave you that things are in good shape, I brought this headline in, Colorado incomes take a big hit. It's from today's paper, and we're seeing tremendous problems, economic problems, that'll only be made worse if you vote this through. So I'm going to ask you to vote no on it. There are projections of about 30,000 jobs lost, more than we hope to create this year. 30,000 jobs lost over the 5 years if this goes through.
Let me react. First of all, the study that he cited, and I hate to go through this, but we have to go through it all the time because we don't seem to be able to properly read the study even according to the author. It doesn't say that there are 30,000 jobs lost. What it says is that we're going to have real robust growth over the next 6 years, and he says, based on a black box analysis that we can't quite figure out what it is, that if this passes, we will not create 30,000 jobs that we might have created otherwise. But remember, that's on top of robust growth. I urge you again to read the study. I also feel very good about the fact that voters did what they did on Ref C and on Amendment 23, because Penn's right. I'm not questioning his facts at all. It did make a huge difference. And even with those decisions, the state of Colorado in the last 2 years has taken $612 per student out of our school finance formula. So let me repeat that. $612 out of per student out of our school finance formula over the last 2 years. And that's with the money that he referenced. Where in the heck would our schools have been if we hadn't gone to the ballot, exercised our right to say that public education is important to us? I want to underscore one more thing before we get to looks like wrap-ups. I am not selling this as the solution to the K-12 education or higher education challenges that we face in this state. I don't want to do that. One of the reasons it's a temporary measure is because we know it is not the solution. But at a time when we are pulling the kind of money that we're pulling out of classrooms, make it more and more difficult for those kids to get what they need, the foundation of an education, so that they can become the workforce and the small business owners of tomorrow. While we're pulling that money out, I don't know how we call that a balanced approach, and all this does is keep us from pulling more money out of that system. That's all. This isn't the answer to the problem. This isn't going to get us to where we need to be. It is going to stop the cuts and give us an opportunity to think about how we go forward. Senator Heath, who is the primary proponent of this, is a huge advocate, as many of us are, of developing an education system that works for all kids. That work must go on. But it is not reform without resources. We are already leading the country in education reform, and we are not going to be able to implement those accountability reforms unless we stop cutting the resources upon which those reforms can be made.
Okay. How about your final remark?
When we talk about what's important to us, we got to recognize there are trade-offs. Everyone wants their kids educated. They want them educated well. You've been told if you do this very large tax increase right now, that that'll solve the problem or get us closer. It will not. It will go into a general fund that has no direction, no accountability, no reporting that this is where a change in revenue receipts will be known, will be tracked well. It's not going to happen. If you're going to be stewards about funds, you've got to recognize that there's a balance between families and business and all the other needs in this state besides education. And this group is not offering you that opportunity. It's going to damage education. It's certainly not right. It's certainly not reasonable. I would ask, as you think about voting, that you remember the voting is early this year. Vote your October ballot. It's got to be there by November 1. And I'd urge you to vote no on Proposition 103. It's not very bright for Colorado. It's going to do us damage, and it's not something you want to further.
Are there any questions from the audience? We have a couple of minutes. No? Okay, I guess you've heard the arguments, and you'll decide then in November, and it will be a mail-in ballot. Thank you.
If I can just
Sure.
say, because I haven't asked for that vote, and it's important. I think this is an important debate, and Penn, I really appreciate the tone and tenor of the discussion today. Penn and I have the privilege of showing up together at forums across the state, and sometimes we get a little angry with one another, and because we do both so care about the future of the state. So thank you for keeping such a great attitude, and I really put on my happy face tonight too. I just want us all to think about the question of whether or not the state is better off if we take another $250, $300 million out of our education system. It's as simple as that. That's where we are, and it is about the families. And remember that we have an income tax system that you only pay taxes if you have income. And it is important that we think about that this isn't a solution. I hope I've made it clear. I'm not characterizing it as a solution, but I hope that the question that you consider as you sit at your kitchen table or your dining room table and cast your ballot is whether or not we're better off today or in the future if we continue to cut the very foundation of our economy, our public schools. Please vote yes on Proposition 103.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists, to our studio audience, and to our viewing audience.